Welcome to Mr. Horror, where we bring you the scariest true stories. Today's stories are about school lockdowns that went horribly wrong. Get ready for a terrifying ride. It was just an ordinary day at the high school until the announcement came over the intercom. Attention all students and staff, this is not a drill. We are now in a code red lockdown. I repeat, this is not a drill. All students and staff, please follow lockdown procedures immediately. Panic ensued as students and teachers rushed to lock classroom doors and turn off the lights. The only sound was the pounding of hearts and heavy breathing as everyone waited in silence, hoping that this was just a false alarm. But then, a loud banging on the classroom door shattered the silence, causing everyone to jump in terror. The banging continued, and soon, the door began to shake violently. Students huddled in the corners of the classroom, holding their breath and praying that the intruder would go away. But the banging persisted and then suddenly stopped. The classroom was silent once again, except for the sound of footsteps slowly walking away. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that it was all over. But it wasn't. Soon, the sound of breaking glass echoed through the halls, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps getting closer and closer. And then the door to the classroom burst open, and a figure dressed in all black stood in the doorway. The students screamed in terror as the intruder lunged towards them, brandishing a weapon. Chaos erupted as the students tried to flee, but the intruder was too fast. One by one, the students fell until only a few remained, cowering in fear in the corner of the room. The intruder approached them slowly, and in the dim light, they could see that it was a man, his face twisted in a grotesque smile. He raised his weapon, ready to strike, but then suddenly froze. The sound of police sirens could be heard in the distance, getting closer and closer. The intruder hesitated for a moment before fleeing the scene, leaving behind a trail of destruction and terror. The students were left in shock and disbelief, wondering who could have done such a thing, and why. As the police arrived and began their investigation, the school was placed on lockdown for the remainder of the day, leaving the students and staff shaken and traumatized by the horrific events that had just taken place. Little did they know, this was just the beginning of a series of terrifying school lockdowns that would haunt them for weeks to come. After the first school lockdown incident, the students and staff at the high school were on edge. Security measures were tightened, and the police were present on campus every day. But despite their efforts to prevent another attack, the unthinkable happened. It was a cloudy Monday afternoon when the announcement came over the intercom once again. Attention all students and staff, this is not a drill. We are now in a code red lockdown. I repeat, this is not a drill. All students and staff, please follow lockdown procedures immediately. The students and staff immediately sprang into action, locking the doors and turning off the lights. But this time, they were not alone. They could hear the sounds of someone moving around outside the classroom, and it was clear that this was not a drill. Suddenly, there was a loud crash, and the door to the classroom burst open. The students and staff screamed as a group of masked intruders rushed into the room, brandishing weapons and screaming incoherently. Panic ensued as the intruders began to attack, their weapons glinting in the dim light of the classroom. Students and staff fought back as best they could, but the intruders were too powerful. The room was a scene of chaos and terror as the intruders roamed the room, attacking anyone in their path. Blood was everywhere, and the screams of the injured and dying echoed through the halls. But then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the intruders stopped. They looked around as if confused before turning and running out of the classroom. The students and staff were left in a state of shock and disbelief, wondering what had just happened. The police arrived on the scene quickly, but the intruders were long gone, leaving behind a trail of devastation and terror. In the aftermath of the second school lockdown, rumors began to circulate about who was responsible for the attacks. Some said it was a group of students seeking revenge, while others believed it was an outsider with a grudge against the school. Despite their best efforts to prevent another attack, the students and staff at the high school remained on edge, never knowing when the next lockdown would occur. The trauma of the attacks would stay with them for years to come, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the darkness that lurks in the world. The final school lockdown occurred on a crisp autumn morning, just as the students and staff were settling into their classes. The announcement came over the intercom once again, sending a shiver of fear through everyone in the building. This time, there was no sound of intruders outside the classroom, no banging on the doors. But the silence was somehow even more terrifying than the chaos of the previous lockdowns. As the minutes ticked by, the students and staff waited in silence, wondering what was happening outside the classroom doors. They could hear the faint sounds of police sirens in the distance, getting closer and closer, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the lockdown was lifted. The police entered the building, searching for any sign of danger, but finding nothing. It wasn't until later that day that the students and staff learned the truth about the final school lockdown. A student who had been suffering from a severe mental illness had barricaded himself in one of the classrooms, threatening to harm himself and anyone who tried to stop him. Thankfully, the police were able to talk him down and he was taken to a psychiatric hospital for treatment, but the damage had already been done. The students and staff were left traumatized by the events of the past few weeks, wondering how they could ever feel safe in their own school again. In the days and weeks that followed, the high school implemented new security measures, including increased police presence and metal detectors at the entrances. The students and staff were encouraged to seek counseling to help them process their trauma and move forward. And slowly but surely, life at the high school began to return to normal. The students went back to their classes, the teachers resumed their lessons, and the fear that had gripped the school began to fade. But the memory of the school lockdowns would stay with them forever, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk in even the most seemingly safe places. And they would never forget the courage and resilience of those who had survived the attacks and the strength of the human spirit in the face of unspeakable terror. It was a normal Tuesday morning when the students and staff at the local middle school heard the announcement over the intercom. Attention all students and staff, we are now in a code red lockdown. I repeat, we are now in a code red lockdown. Please follow lockdown procedures immediately. Panic immediately set in as everyone in the building began to follow protocol, locking doors and turning off lights. The hallways were filled with the sounds of heavy breathing and the pounding of hearts as everyone waited for the all clear. But then the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway. They were slow, deliberate, and getting closer and closer. Everyone in the building held their breath, praying that the intruder would pass them by. But he didn't. The man, dressed in dirty clothes and wielding a gun, burst into one of the classrooms. The students screamed and huddled in the corners of the room, trying to hide from the man's gaze. The intruder looked around the room, his eyes scanning the frightened faces of the students. He seemed to hesitate for a moment before turning and leaving the room. The students breathed a sigh of relief, but it was short-lived. The sound of gunshots echoed through the halls, and screams could be heard from other parts of the building. The man was on the move, and no one was safe. As the minutes turned into hours, the students and staff remained in lockdown, waiting for the police to arrive and take down the intruder. It was a time of terror and uncertainty, a nightmare that seemed to have no end. But finally, after what felt like an eternity, the sound of police sirens could be heard in the distance, getting closer and closer. And then the sound of gunshots filled the air, followed by silence. The intruder had been taken down and the lockdown was lifted. The students and staff emerged from their hiding places, shaken and traumatized by the events of the day. It was a day that no one in the school would ever forget, a day when the terror and violence of the outside world had invaded their safe haven. And they knew that they would never be the same again. In the aftermath of the school lockdown, the students and staff were left in a state of shock and disbelief. They had never thought that something like this could happen in their school, in their town. But it had, and they had been forced to confront the reality of violence and terror in the world. As the police arrived on the scene and began their investigation, details began to emerge about the intruder. He was a mentally unstable man who had a history of violence, and he had been able to easily enter the school with his gun. The students and staff were horrified that something like this could happen, and they demanded answers from the school administration and the local government. They wanted to know how this man had been able to enter the school undetected and what steps were being taken to prevent a similar incident from happening in the future. But the answers were slow in coming, and in the meantime, the students and staff were left to grapple with their fear and trauma. Many of them sought counseling to help them process the events of the day, while others struggled to come to terms with what had happened. And then, just a few weeks later, the unthinkable happened again. Another school lockdown was announced, and the students and staff were forced to relive the horror of the previous incident. This time, the intruder was a former student who had been expelled from the school. He had returned with a vengeance, seeking revenge on those who had wronged him. The students and staff were prepared this time, however. They had learned from the previous incident, and they were ready to fight back. As the intruder entered one of the classrooms, he was met with a barrage of chairs, textbooks, and anything else that the students and staff could get their hands on. They fought back with everything they had, determined to protect themselves and each other. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the intruder was taken down by the police. The lockdown was lifted, and the students and staff emerged from their classrooms, victorious but still shaken by the events of the day. It was a moment of triumph, but also a moment of realization. The students and staff knew that they could never let their guard down, that they could never assume that they were safe. They had to be vigilant, always on the lookout for danger, always prepared to fight back. It was a lesson that they would carry with them for the rest of their lives, a lesson that had been learned in the most terrifying way possible. And they knew that they would never forget the courage and resilience that they had shown in the face of unspeakable terror. After the second school lockdown, the students and staff were more determined than ever to prevent a similar incident from happening again. They demanded action from the school administration and the local government, and they refused to be silenced until their voices were heard. Their efforts paid off, and soon new security measures were implemented in the school. Metal detectors were installed at the entrances, and there was a greater police presence on campus. The students and staff felt safer, more protected, and more confident in their ability to defend themselves in case of an emergency. But even as they moved forward, they never forgot the events of that fateful day. They remembered the fear and the uncertainty, but they also remembered the bravery and the determination that had allowed them to survive. And they knew that they would always carry those memories with them, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of being prepared for the worst. In the years that followed, the school became a model for others in terms of its security measures and emergency preparedness. And the students and staff who had been there on that fateful day became leaders in the fight for safer schools and communities. Their experience had changed them, but it had also empowered them. They knew that they had survived something that could have destroyed them, and they were determined to use that strength to make a positive difference in the world. In the end, the story of the school lockdowns was not just one of terror and tragedy, but also one of resilience and hope. It was a story of ordinary people rising to the occasion, of finding the courage to face their fears and overcome them. And it was a story that would continue to inspire and motivate others for years to come. The morning at the local elementary school was like any other day. The students were excited to start their classes and see their friends, while the teachers were busy preparing their lessons. But just as the first class was about to begin, an urgent announcement came over the intercom. Attention all students and staff, we are now in a code red lockdown. I repeat, we are now in a code red lockdown. Please follow lockdown procedures immediately. Panic immediately set in as the students and staff followed protocol, locking doors and turning off lights. The classrooms were filled with the sound of heavy breathing and the pounding of hearts as everyone waited for the all clear. But then there was a sound that sent shivers down everyone's spines. It was a low, guttural growl coming from the hallway. The students and staff froze, holding their breath as the growling continued. And then the sound of heavy footsteps, approaching closer and closer. As the sound grew louder, the students and staff realized with horror that there was an intruder in the building. They could hear him pounding on the doors, trying to find a way in. The students huddled together, trying to stay quiet and stay hidden. But the intruder was relentless, and it wasn't long before he found the classroom. The door shook as the intruder pounded on it with his fist, screaming and cursing. The students were paralyzed with fear, not knowing what to do. But then one of the students remembered the emergency protocol. She crawled under a desk and reached for the phone on the wall. With shaking hands, she dialed 911 and whispered into the receiver. It wasn't long before the police arrived, guns drawn and ready to take down the intruder. The lockdown was lifted, and the students and staff emerged from their hiding places, traumatized by the events of the day. It was a day that would live in infamy at the elementary school, a day when the safety and security of their learning environment was shattered. And they knew that they would never forget the fear and terror that they had experienced that day. As the police arrived on the scene and began their investigation, it became clear that the intruder was not acting alone. There were reports of multiple intruders in the building, all armed and dangerous. The students and staff were horrified to learn this, and they became more determined than ever to protect themselves and each other. They huddled together in their classrooms, waiting for any news or updates. But the news was not good. There were reports of gunshots, screams, and chaos throughout the building. The police were doing everything they could to stop the intruders, but it seemed like they were always one step ahead. The students and staff knew that they had to take action. They began to push desks and chairs against the doors, creating makeshift barricades to keep the intruders out. They also used anything they could find as weapons, from textbooks to staplers, preparing to fight back if necessary. As the minutes turned into hours, the students and staff remained in lockdown, waiting for the police to take down the intruders. It was a time of terror and uncertainty, a nightmare that seemed to have no end. But then, a glimmer of hope. The sound of police sirens could be heard in the distance, getting closer and closer. And then, the sound of gunshots filled the air, followed by silence. The students and staff held their breath, waiting for any news, and then, finally, they heard it. The lockdown was lifted, and the police had taken down the intruders. As they emerged from their hiding places, the students and staff were traumatized by what they had witnessed. They saw the devastation that the intruders had caused, the shattered windows, the bullet holes in the walls, the bloodstains on the floor. But they were also filled with a sense of pride and strength. They had survived a terrifying ordeal, and they had fought back with everything they had. They knew that they had the courage and the resilience to face any challenge that came their way. In the aftermath of the lockdown, the students and staff received counseling and support to help them cope with the trauma. They also worked with the school administration and the local government to implement new security measures and emergency protocols to ensure that something like this never happened again. But even as they moved forward, the students and staff could never forget the events of that fateful day. They knew that they had been forever changed by the experience, and they would carry the memories of it with them for the rest of their lives. The school lockdown had left a lasting impact on everyone who had been involved. The students and staff had faced unspeakable terror, but they had also shown incredible bravery and resilience. In the weeks and months that followed, the school implemented new security measures and emergency protocols, and the students and staff underwent training to prepare themselves for any future emergencies. They knew that they had to be ready for anything. But the memories of the lockdown never faded away. They remained a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of being prepared for the worst. The students and staff became advocates for safer schools and communities, using their experience to raise awareness and promote change. They spoke at rallies, wrote letters to their elected officials, and worked to make their voices heard. And in the end, their efforts paid off. The school became a model for others in terms of its security measures and emergency preparedness. The students and staff who had been there on that fateful day became leaders in the fight for a safer world. The school lockdown had been a tragedy, but it had also been a catalyst for change. It had shown the students and staff what they were truly capable of, and it had brought them together in a way that they had never been before. And so, as they looked back on that day, they did not just see fear and horror. They also saw bravery, determination, and hope. They knew that they would never forget the lessons they had learned, and they would continue to fight for a world where everyone could feel safe and secure. Thank you for watching this true and scary school lockdown horror stories video. We hope that this stories has reminded you of the importance of being prepared for any emergency and the need for safer schools and communities. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell to stay updated on our latest videos. Your support means everything to us, and it allows us to continue bringing you more stories like this one. We also encourage you to share this video with your friends and family to spread awareness about the importance of safety and preparedness. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Stay safe.